Hey to all heavy metal maniacs and welcome to another video on Iron Horde channel here on YouTube. Another video here on Sunday. We are currently going around the world choosing the essential albums with regards to 80s heavy metal. Those albums which have left a mark on each different scene, each different national scene. Albums which are on the most part very underrated, very unknown outside of the boundaries of that specific country. Just a short summary of the previous episode. We started with the new wave of British heavy metal, therefore from the UK, went to the US and spoke about the US power metal scene, then came to Scandinavia, France, Italy, Spain, Germany, and for this episode I'm going to join two countries together which I think share some similarities between each other, although there are specific differences as well, but two relatively smaller countries which I decided to join in one episode. This is not to say that from these countries there isn't a number of great bands from it, but considering everything, when I shortlisted the bands and everything, I decided to join them up in one video. So there's no time to lose. Let's go straight to the lowlands and find out another set of great 80s heavy metal albums. Let's go! Thanks for joining us again for this video. Our job here is to review albums, suggest bands, review festivals, speak about cultural aspects of heavy metal. So if that is of interest to you, please consider subscribing and liking and sharing these episodes and videos, clicking on the bell as well so you are notified whenever we post a video. So as I said, we're going to tackle two countries in this episode. If you haven't seen the previous episodes on this series of videos, I'm going to link up here the playlist of that series. Two of the most influential scenes in the 80s were none other than the UK with the new wave of British heavy metal and the German heavy metal scene. And both these countries lie in between of these two countries, so they will be undoubtedly affected by both scenes. Being larger, more bands from the German and the UK scene made it big, so to speak, and therefore they had a big influence on both of these countries. Whilst doing my research for this episode, I also found something which I didn't know before, that there is also a good history of bands from the 70s playing hard rock from both Belgium and Holland, and it was quite surprising to me, although I knew about the good number of heavy metal bands, but I wasn't expecting such a number of hard rock 70s bands similar to Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin. I guess those bands had a big influence on the bands that followed in the 80s. As we all know, heavy metal around the world exploded actually in the 80s, and this was no difference between both Holland and Belgium, but most of these bands unfortunately remained very obscure, very unknown. There were countries in previous episodes where, although the countries are quite underrated, but there was one or two bands which you could say they made it big, or at least had some successful tours outside of their countries. But this is not so much for both the Dutch and the Belgian bands. Even though most of these bands didn't have that much of a success, there was one successful aspect coming out of, more specifically, Belgium, which is the label Mausoleum Records. Over the years, this record label has gathered a big respect in the underground scene for a certain period of time. It was inactive, but then it was reactivated again, if I'm not mistaken, in the early years of 2000. But Mausoleum Records, in contrast to other labels in different heavy metal scenes, which for those who followed the previous episodes know that each scene had kind of the prominent record label which helped the bands from that country emerge. But with Mausoleum Records went outside of the Belgian borders, having bands from the US such as Tyrant, Void, Black Lace, Jack Panzer, and even bands from the new wave of British heavy metal like Wolf, Wildfire, which is a band I included in my new wave of British heavy metal video, which I'm linking up here. You can see that this label had a big effect on the underground scene, not only the Belgian scene but even the European and American scene. Personally, whenever I see an album by Mausoleum Records, I always end up listening to it because generally they are good to great albums, so it is a stamp of approval, so to speak. So anyways, enough with the history lessons, and let's go straight to the list of the 10 albums I have chosen from both the Dutch and Belgian scene. I have split them up in 2 categories. First 5 will be the Dutch albums, second 5 will be the Belgian albums. In no particular order, just random. So for me, all of these albums, except a couple of them which I think they are on a better level than the rest, but the differences are very minimal, so consider all these albums on the same level. First album on this list, Proud Existence, The Trial, released in 1988 on Paladin Records. Quite possibly the least known album on this list, but quite possibly also my favorite album from this list. I consider this album as a perfect mix of US power metal and new wave of British heavy metal. I really like the vocals on here, although they might sound a bit strange to most. They remind me of the vocals from Ragnar Valkvist from Heavy Load, a bit thicker aspect kind of, which was quite common in the Central to Northern European heavy metal scenes, this kind of vocals, not being operatic, not being rough like Lemmy, but rather, as I said, on the thicker side of the spectrum. Anyways, you just have to go and search for the band and judge for yourself. Having said that though, these vocals, there are certain parts when they burst out into screams which will catch your attention, because when something is flowing on the same wavelength, then there's one moment when the vocals go really high, especially in the first listens when you're not really prepared for it. It really catches your attention. Most of the tracks here are mid-tempo, but with touches of a more darker approach, a more obscure kind of approach as well, and that is what makes me give a certain preference to this record, because first of all, it's rarely spoken about, and I think very few people outside of Holland and maybe the neighboring countries know about them, so I was always attached to this record. This might be mainly because this band, after the release of this album, practically disbanded, so their existence was very short. But it is definitely an album not to be missed, but if I had to choose a favorite track, it would be Deliver or Kill. Next album on this list is from the band Misto Disto, and the album titled The Rules Have Been Disturbed, released in 1986, a record which has been released independently by the band themselves. This is kind of a cult record nowadays. It is a record which mixes speed metal, mostly it is a speed metal album with hints of thrash as well, especially on the tracks Tarantula and Full Speed to Hell. There are some mid-tempo tracks as well, as One Night Stand for example, and Visit of the Vikings. Sometimes on the faster tracks they remind me of the band Artillery, especially the kind of music they had released on the album By Inheritance. The vocals are quite unique as well, similar to the previous record I spoke about. It takes some time to get into them, but they are so good even in the lower and the higher frequencies. They are really good and fit with the music we have on this record. From the composition aspect, everything feels like it fits in its place, especially the guitar solos. The riffs are so catchy, so good, considering it is a speed metal album, so the focus will be on the tempo, but there's still that kind of inherent melody, catchiness in it, which really makes it a very good album. Maybe it lacks a bit on the production side and you cannot really hear the bass, and for me, and for those who have listened to previous videos I did, for me to hear the bass in an album is very important. But other than that, this is a very good record, one that shouldn't be missed. I think it's an essential one from the 80s heavy metal Dutch scene. It's unfortunate that it was released independently, with probably lacked the distribution to reach a bigger crowd, but I understand that nowadays this album has been followed much more, although it still remains a cult record, but it receives a bit of recognition, which I think it thoroughly deserves. If I had to choose a favorite track on here, it would be Attila the Destructor. Next album on this list is from the band Horizon. The title is Master of the Game, released in 1985 by CBS Records. Definitely another classic Dutch record. A bit more melodic this time round. We have the inclusion as well of the keyboards on this record, so with regards to influences here, we have a lot of what I recall one of the most famous band would be Europe. But I also hear influence from 70s hard rock / metal from bands like Rainbow, and also from the more melodic bands from the new wave of British heavy metal like Demon. That is kind of the mix here. It's not really so much, I mentioned Europe, okay, but it isn't so focused on the keyboards as much as Europe, where they delivered a much more mainstream sound, but you can hear those influences in certain parts of the tracks on this record. In fact, this record is essentially a mix of 70s hard rock and 80s melodic metal. In contrast to the previous album, something that this record always brought to my attention is the sound of the bass guitar, which is very prominent in every part of the tracks and make the track so much better. They feel fuller, kind of. They feel more meaty to a certain extent. So that is the difference between certain aspects of the production from one album to another, although the previous album was more speed, more thrashy. Generally in these records, the bass is kind of drowned by the guitars, but with regards to this album, it's really prominent, and I think it's a very positive aspect. I really love the track Dreams on here, which is one of my favorite tracks on this record. Runaway Guy and Rock This Place are the faster tracks on this album, so for those who prefer a more faster tempo, you should start from those tracks. The title track on this record is leaning towards being a bit more of a neo-noir melodic kind of track. It's still good, but it's a bit on the softer side of the spectrum. I would like to make a special mention here on this album for the vocals of Semi Avigal, rest in peace. Apart from being a great vocalist, he is also present on another legendary Dutch band with the name Picture, and also with the US classic heavy metal band The Rods on their 1986 record titled Heavier Than Thou. I think he deserved to be mentioned specifically on this record and in general for his great contribution to heavy metal. As I said, favorite track on this album is Dreams. Next album on this list is titled 3 Times Running by the band Bodine, released in 1983 by Rhinoceros Records. I decided to choose the third record from this band because I feel it is the more mature, more complete album from their discography, and it also has a better production which aids in giving this album a bigger status. This band has been mainly known throughout the years for having Arjen Lucassen on guitars. We know Arjen Lucassen from his solo project Arion, which became very famous, but he started playing as a band, or one of his most prominent bands, earliest bands, is Bodine. And I have to say, both Arjen Lucassen and the other guitarist on this record do one hell of a job. I think they are the backbone of this record. The twin guitar leads are magnificent on each and every track. They are the highlight on this record. You'll find a lot of catchy hooks on this record, great melodies, and even great vocals as well. So we have to say that most of these records have great vocalists. Some of them have peculiar vocal tones, but I think, as far as I'm concerned, they fit perfectly to the music of each album, being the more high-pitched vocals, the more raw vocals, the rougher vocals. All of them are good and fit perfectly to the music. If I had to describe the music on this album, it would be a mix of Judas Priest, Scorpions, Dio, with sometimes a more hard rock edge. They aren't heavy metal to a certain extent like Judas Priest from start to finish, like on Screaming on Vengeance or Defenders of the Faith, yet you can clearly hear in parts the influence of these bands, although the band then create their own unique sound on this record, which makes them recognizable as far as I'm concerned. Take for example one of the best tracks on here, which is Black Star Rising. It has, once you listen to it, it has its own identity, and it's very catchy. There is also an instrumental as well on here, which is really good, titled Below the Belt. Not much more to say apart from the fact that it's a very solid album, and I think it's one of the best from the Dutch scene, at least from the 80s heavy metal scene, if not from the whole history of bands coming out of Holland with regards to classic heavy metal. Favorite track on here would be the track The Force. So we have arrived to the last album from the Dutch scene, a band that I have mentioned already by the name of Picture. The album is Diamond Dreamer, released in 1982 with Backdoor Records. I think this band is the most famous in general to come out from the 80s heavy metal scene from Holland. Like Bodine, I have chosen to speak about the third album from that discography, and for the same reasons, coincidentally as before, that I think it's their best album and the most complete. A band which is still active nowadays, and they have released 10 full-length albums, the last one being released in 2019. As I said before, we have also here the great vocals of Semi Avigal. Both Picture and Horizon are similar in style, although in Picture we don't have the keyboards like in Horizon, but the vocals really fit well with these two bands and the styles they have on offer. Most of the album relies on mid-tempo tracks, and we don't go in the faster territory here like most of the Dutch bands I have chosen on this list. If I had to describe the sound of this band, I would say similar, very similar to 70s Judas Priest, some hard rock like Crocus, even Dio as well, the style of that heavy metal coming from the US with the melody and the catchy riffs. Anyway, you get the gist, which I'm trying to explain here with the explanation using these bands that I have just said. Something that has always come to mind when listening to the opening riff of the title track is that it totally reminds me of Merciful Fate. And there are other parts throughout the album, certain riffs, certain parts, not very frequent, that remind me of Merciful Fate. But the intro on the title track, go and listen to it, because, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, it is so similar to something that Merciful Fate would have in their album. If I had to choose a favorite track on here, it would be Lousy Lady. So let's go straight now to the Belgian scene, and the first album I have on this list is from the band Warhead with the album Speedway, released in 1984 with Mausoleum Records. A classic album from the Belgian scene, that's for sure. Total speed metal on here, and very rough, very gritty. Actually, speed metal in most of these albums I'm going to speak about from the Belgian scene will be the common denominator. Love the cover art as well, simple yet effective, and I'm always up for some red and black as well. As I said, the sound here is very raw, very dirty, kind of reminds me of new wave of British heavy metal bands with that style, kind of tank, atomcraft, warfare, but they take this sound and make it a bit faster as well. You just can feel that energy, that youthful vigor in the musicians here. Nothing is too complicated, but the way it's executed with so much power takes this album to another level as far as I'm concerned. The vocals as well have that rougher edge, and they really fit the music. Highlight tracks for me are the opening track Speedway, Driver and Attack of the Shark. Favorite track though is Devil's Child. I really love the intro on this track, apart from the rest of the track, but the intro really remains ingrained in your head. Next album on this list is by the band Ostrogoth. The album Ecstasy and Danger, released in 1984, again with Mausoleum Records. Going more to a mid-tempo album now with this one. It reminds me a lot of bands coming from the US power metal scene. Think Omen, Liege Lord, Hellstar. That is the kind of sound being played by Ostrogoth on this particular record. I'm saying on this particular record because previous to this album, which was the debut for them, they had a very successful EP titled Full Moon's Eyes, and it was a bit faster, more leaning towards the speed metal aspect. But this one is more mid-tempo, and I think personally I prefer it. I prefer not the style as such, because I love both styles, but I think Ostrogoth's really kicked it up a notch on this record with this music given on this particular album. Vocals are obviously more powerful, cleaner to go along with the music. Production is very good, one of the best I might say on this list. It really accentuates the music we have over here. My highlight tracks on this record are Stormbringer, The New Generation, and also the track Scream Out. But the best track on this album for me is the opening track Queen of Desire, which is possibly their most famous track in the underground scene. It is the longest track on this record as well, reaching about 7 minutes or thereabouts. The vocal melodies on here are so good. I think they are the highlight, especially on this track. But it is kind of epic in certain parts. I think it's an extremely good track and one that should be highlighted as much as possible. Next album by the band Crossfire, titled See You in Hell, released in 1983, again by Mausoleum Records. This is the third album in a row by this record label, which shows you the importance and the influence it had on the scene back then. The sound on here is very similar to Ostrogoth, albeit a bit rougher and a bit faster as well, but not as fast as the speed metal bands, yet not as mid-tempo as Ostrogoth. Vocals by Peter De Vint, which at times remind me of Mark Storace from Crocus. Peter De Vint, which would later become a renowned sound engineer, working with bands such as Wasp, Twisted Sister, Glenn Hughes, Jeff Scott Soto, Joel Turner and many others. Curiously enough, on bass on this album we have Patrick Van Londerzele, I hope I said the surname correctly, which was the vocalist on the previous Warhead album that I have mentioned. With regards to influences, definitely you can hear some Iron Maiden in here. In fact, there's a track titled Demon of Evil, and the intro to that track is very, very similar to Number of the Beast. Tracks then like Fly High and Star Child remind me of 80s Judas Priest, whilst Danger on Earth is a more mid-tempo track on the more slower kind of spectrum compared to the other tracks on this record. Favorite track though on here would be Magnificent Night, speed metal track which slows down a bit in the middle. You think that from then onwards the track will be keeping that kind of soft lower approach, but then at one moment it kicks back in, and it's such a great track, so greatly composed, so greatly structured. But it is not the only track which is good on this record. Most of them have these standout tracks like I'm mentioning, but this one has always been a favorite track of mine. Acid is the name, heavy metal is the game. It is the phrase that greets you on the next record by the band Acid. It's their self-titled record released in 1983 with Giant Records. What we have here is pure, unadulterated speed metal. The highlight being the vocals of Kate DeLombert again, I hope I said the surname correctly. One of the best, I might say, female-fronted bands ever. With that raspy, raw, aggressive approach and no romanticized operatic vocals, which many times kind of are associated with female vocals. In this regard, I think the 80s really showed us how the female vocals should sound and their approach and the attitude on stage. So I think in the underground heavy metal scene, Kate is regarded as one of the top vocalists of the scene. Thinking about it, I should really do a video with my favorite female fronted bands. So I think I will be doing one soon. Well, I don't know if it's very soon because there's a long list and people are starting to tell me also do this, take that, review that album and choose this country. And I'm happy about that. I'm actually really happy with the feedback I'm getting from bands and fans alike, and keep them coming because that is what I want. I want your input. These channels are obviously made to interact with each other and expand our knowledge about the things we love, and with regards to this channel, the thing we love is heavy metal. Old school heavy metal. The production on this record is very similar to bands coming from the new wave of British heavy metal, very raw and rough. At times I can feel kind of a punk attitude from the production and even from the band. An influence on here would definitely be Motorhead and I think also Girl School. This might be because we have female vocals, so the sound kind of makes you think of other female fronted bands, but Acid I think took that sound and totally ran with it and as fast as they could and turned it into speed metal. Just listen for example to the intros to the tracks Hell on Wheels or Hooked on Metal, just pure headbanging action. The track Demon, for example, for a few initial seconds implies a softer, more mid-tempo approach, but then you understand that no, there will be no relenting on this record. It immediately takes you back to that frantic territory, that speed metal territory, which is the kind of epitome of this record. Although, as I said, this album is relentless in its pace, it never gets boring, it never gets tiring, because the tracks are done so well and they are so catchy and the riffs are so good that I assure you, if you like the style, your attention will remain from start to finish. This record was actually released in January of 1983, and the next album by Acid was released that same year in November, and it's an equally good speed metal record, so to release such landmark albums in the space of 10 months shows you how the band at that time was basically on fire. If I had to choose a favorite track from this record, it would be the track Satan. So we have arrived to the last album on this video, the 5th album from the Belgian scene, and the last band is probably the heavy metal band from Belgium. The band is Killer, and the name of the album is Wall of Sound, released in 1982 with Lark Records. This band is renowned as the Motorhead of Belgium, so needless to say, their music is very similar, not entirely, but mostly to the band Motorhead. The rough vocal, the speedy up-tempo and the double bass drum define the sound of this band. Actually, the previous drummer with Killer and producer on this record was one of the founders of the renowned Mausoleum Records. The title track, Blinded, Bodies and Bones, Kleptomania are all highlight tracks on this record. But if I had to choose a favorite track on here, it would be Battle Scars. So this is definitely one of the most iconic albums to come from Belgium, being one of the first bands to release music within this style, and therefore it kind of deserves the first place on this list. But as I told you, these albums aren't ranked as such, and if I had to choose my favorite record, I don't think it would be this one, but I don't know actually which I would choose, but I don't think I would choose this one. But anyway, it's not a question of choosing my favorite record, it's just that these 10 records are so good, and I advise everyone to go search for them. There will be links to the albums in the description below. As you can see, probably the Dutch scene was a bit more melodic, whilst the Belgian scene focused more on speed and faster tempos. But this might be a bit of a generalization as well, maybe attached to the kind of albums I chose, but I think it has some foundation as well. Like I always say, keep on searching. There are more albums, as I said in the introduction as well. As I said, links to the albums will be in our description. There will also be affiliate links, so you can click on them and buy the album. We get a small percentage, but there will be no extra cost for you. So let me know in the comments if you agree with my choices, what albums you would have added or removed. That is why we do these videos. Don't forget to subscribe, share these videos, share them on forums dedicated to these scenes, to the Belgian scene, to the Dutch scene, or other videos, so we can get better feedback as well from people who have maybe lived through these period of times. Click on the bell as well, so you are notified when we release new videos. Until our next videos, stay safe and metal on. Cheers!